To me, I think a little bit of cracking actually kind of looks cool. So I don't mind a few, but this is too many. When I first started my mud journey, I watched a million videos on mud, adobe, cob, and something I struggled with finding in those videos was talking about the cracking. I would really only see kind of the right when the project was finished, so it looked all smooth and pretty. And there were rarely any updates on how the mud has dried, cracked, how you fix it, patch it, make it smooth. That's why I really want to share with you the cracks in my mud and what I do about it. Hello, fellow mudsteaders. I'm Nika, and I'm working really hard on the inside of the Gabion Wallapini to hopefully get some serious mudding done. The truth about cob, mud, adobe is that it cracks. And the reason why is rather simple. And to explain it in the most simplest terms, we have this jar full of dirt and water. The dirt has settled into the bottom, so you can see the difference between the dirt and the water. But they're both taking up volume. And if I were to shake this jar, you get mud. And this is a very thin mud, but I think works as a nice example. That water has taken up space in the mud. Essentially, all the little dirt particles are suspended in that water. That water actually takes up a lot of space. And as that water dries and leaves the mud, it's leaving space within that mud, leading to cracking. And the 3 ways I have found to hinder that cracking is 1, to use fibers, 2, to make thick batches of mud, and 3 is to make thick mud patties on the layers you're creating. The thicker the mud, usually the less cracking. And this wall here is a great example of not making a thick enough layer, leading to some extra cracking. But as I have described before, it's an easy fix. This is just mud. It just needs to be wetted down and the cracks worked. But I'm going to end up doing a whole fat layer over this thinner layer. And I did create a thinner layer to start with because I was having trouble keeping it to stick on the previous mud layer. So sometimes you have to start with a thinner layer before you can add on thicker layers. But ending with a nice fat layer is super helpful. After I gave the area above the bed a good mudding, I started mudding the rest of the walls. Most of this mudding was just kind of an initial primer, thinner layer that I had done just to get everything covered and just going. And even though it was a thinner layer of mud, it was definitely a crazy amount of mud. But it was really fun to finally see these walls taking more shape and looking more natural with that kind of clay color. I like it a whole lot better than kind of the gray color that the other dirt around the property gives. All the walls now have their first official final layer. So then I started the second layer. I made sure to do good amounts of fibers as well as creating as thick a patties as the wall and the mud would allow. Because you can do thick layers, but if they're too thick, they can still droop and goop and possibly kind of fall off the wall. So I did as thick as I could manage, as much as I could, all the way around. It definitely was a whole day crazy mud project, but I definitely got it done. So today I gotta head down to the wash to get more of that awesome clay dirt. And I'm gonna focus on working those cracks in the wall above the bed, as well as kind of fatten up and finish the layers on the rest of the wall. But I'm like this close to being done. Hauling up these buckets of dirt is no joke. Especially when you're like sweating to death and the sweat keeps like getting all up in your eyes. Buckets of water are even heavier to haul around. And a bucket of mud is way heavier than you think it would be. But with how heavy water is, how heavy dirt is, when you mix them together, it makes for a pretty hefty, heavy material. And it's that hefty heaviness of the mud that sometimes makes it so you need to start with a thinner layer before adding on thicker layers. Either because the two layers of mud, they just can't meld well together with that weight, that you may get kind of some peeling off, but also just the weight itself of the mud pulling away or kind of drooping down. So sometimes you have to start with a thinner layer, add thicker layers or a final thick layer. It kind of depends on the individual situation, and sometimes it just takes a little practice and kind of trial and error. And being these are the first full walls like this that I have done down here in Arizona, this is a whole different type of mud and clay and situation and drying situation that I'm working with. So this is kind of the trial and error wall a little bit, and even though it looks like these cracks may be kind of a big error, they're really not. Easy to fix, more layers to add, and to me, I think a little bit of cracking actually kind of looks cool, a little more natural. So I don't mind a few, but this is too many. So I have sprayed this surface a couple of times, but I want to spray it one more time right before I get to adding some more mud and working these cracks. And as I said, using a really good thick mud will really help with the cracking, specifically because there's not as much water that needs to leave the mud with a thicker mud than how much water would need to leave in a thinner mud. If that kind of makes sense, the more water that has to leave the mud, the bigger your cracks may get. So thick mud for the win. But right now I do need it to be slightly thinner, because what I want to do is I want to work thinner mud into these cracks as I kind of press them back together, almost like gluing them together. So what I like to do is I just make a little bowl in my bucket of mud and spray a little water in that bowl, and a little bit of water goes a long way to making a thinner mud. So I don't add too much into the bucket, just enough that I can make a nice thin, like very thin peanut buttery kind of mud. So I'm going to start with kind of this crack right here. I'm going to take that thin peanut buttery mud, and I'm not pressing yet, but I'm just going to kind of fill in the crack with some of that peanut butter. And this does have fibers, so I kind of have to dig the fibers out as I scrape, but that's not a big deal, because if I mush some fibers in there too, that's all the better. And now that that crack's filled, I'm just going to kind of press and work that crack. And you're not going to exactly be able to mush the two sides of the cracks together so much unless the mud is wet enough, and this kind of is, kind of isn't. So by filling in and pressing it, you're filling in the space that the water has left behind. And sometimes this still will crack in that same like space and area, but hopefully it won't be as severe of a crack. If not, hopefully I'll get rid of it altogether anyway, because it's getting another layer. But if I didn't want to do another layer, this is the way that I can kind of fix the wall, smooth it out, and get rid of some of the cracking. And sometimes it would take a couple of go-overs to make it so there's no cracks at all. Like, I have found that it actually takes a lot of working, reworking, and essentially maintenance to keep something super smooth and have like 0 cracks. It's pretty hard to have no cracking in my lengthy mudding, experimenting, and practices. So essentially what I'm going to do is that same thing with this crack to all the cracks. And then I'll go ahead and just do a big, fat, final layer. And the final layer that I'm doing on this wall and on all the other walls, it's going to be the final layer I'm doing, and any cracking that happens, I'll work those cracks much like this. But I'll be doing that more as it dries versus this has been drying a couple of days. So hopefully those cracks will be easier to make gone versus these ones might be a little harder if I were to keep this as the final layer. These ones would take some work, but it's getting another fat layer after this thin one. So if I wasn't putting another layer onto this wall and I wanted just to be done with this wall, after I've filled in all those cracks and kind of worked them, by this time it gets kind of dry and harder to work the mud. So I would dip my hand just into some water and I'd start working the wall, putting as much pressure as I can manage. You don't want to do too much, but definitely so you're pressing and mushing all of those mud layers together. Because this isn't smoothing out yet. This is just working everything together. And then say I did the whole wall and I wanted it to look nice and smooth. It's the same thing, dipping your hand into water and creating that smooth finish. And depending on the fibers you're using, you will get different textures with those fibers. It's totally fly season, y'all. But since I'm adding another thicker layer of mud, there's no need for all of the smoothing, but I do want to kind of keep going and working the mud. So now that I've worked this wall to my personal satisfaction, I'm going to do the final fat layer. And when I say a thick layer of mud, it kind of ranges between a ½ inch and an inch of mud. Depends on what the wall allows me to do. The final layer for this chunk of wall is finished. Doesn't mean the wall itself is finished. And I always try to finish big fat layers like this with those big sweeping motions. It's best to kind of end on an upward smooth out than a downward. So you're kind of pushing all the mud up versus pushing it down. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this sit kind of today and tomorrow, and I'm going to keep kind of working it. Work any cracks that may show up as they show up, so I can actually mush them and smooth them out as they appear, so that I don't have to do that whole filling them in with thinner mud process. And as I work the wall, I'll be doing a lot of pressure and pulling up to smooth, set, adhere the layers together, and just help it keep smooth and keep it from cracking. I may even spray it down a couple of times while it dries to hopefully prevent any cracking. But as I said, if there's a few cracks, that's okay. And as I work this mud, I'll also smooth it out. But this wall will not get any more major mud. It's been a couple of days and this wall is drying so much better with that fat layer. There still is some cracking, but it's very surface cracking. So it's easier to fix, not as deep cracking as the other cracks were, and these will be easily workable since this is still actually kind of wet, being that it was a fatter layer that just takes a lot longer to dry, which means I have more time to work it and get it smooth. And being at this drying, still wet stage, it is possible to just work the cracks with my finger, press, and essentially fill them in and squish them back together. But even if I decided not to work this too much more, unless it cracked like a little more as it finished drying, this looks pretty great to me. And I got about halfway down this chunk of the wall with the big fat layer, but my arm's pretty tired. I'm gonna take a little bit of a mudding break and work on some wood shelving. I'm so excited to create a space and place for all the things. Happy building! Peace!